Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our weekly Convocation series. We've got a couple folks helpful if you're still filling out a slip of paper and you'd like to enter into a drawing for a copy of Dr. Costello's book on Black Elk. You're welcome to do that. I know Whitney and Joseph are helping, and we'll do that drawing at the end of Dr. Costello's talk. I want to publicly thank our University of Reed committee for providing books. A number of you have been involved in some book study efforts that we've had over the last couple of weeks on Dr. Costello's books. There's been good dialogue going on already, so we appreciate that, and we want to be thankful to them, and also our university's Convocation committee for sponsoring this convocation. As you know, we've had a week of events formerly called the Black Elk Convocation and Forum. Starting on Monday, we partnered with University Ministry to talk a little bit about the Convocation and Forum during homecoming. So if you see some of us professors and we're shocking you with our dress-down attire, that's why we're doing it. We're doing it in support of homecoming and also in support of money that we donate towards really noble causes here at the University of Mary. Tuesday, we were involved in service along with the day of service. Up to 57 students and faculty went down to Standing Rock to serve the people of Standing Rock and work with the people of Standing Rock at St. Bernard Mission and the Catholic Indian Mission. So that was a good day as well. And then yesterday, a number of events, and then, of course, today. If you want more of this discussion in our classroom in Boniface 306, we're going to host a discussion during the cultural diversity class, and you're welcome to come there as well. We'll squeeze in as many as we can for that discussion. Tomorrow will be a wrap-up of the whole week. The North Dakota Heritage Museum and Center is hosting a discussion. We have at least one panel member, two panel members here in that discussion from 1 to 3 p.m. We'll be talking about Black Elk through the lens of Native American people. These are cultural coordinators from the school district of Mandan and Bismarck. We also have Mr. Bobby Gray Eagle here, who's here today, that'll be on the panel, and then, of course, our speaker, Dr. Costello. So if we can center ourselves and get ourselves ready for prayer, and then I'll introduce our speaker, and we'll get on with the presentation. Prior to our prayer, I just want to acknowledge the land here. Of course, this is University of Mary is here, but it's also known as Maya Wasikapi, the place where they carry paint. This would be what the Lakota people and Dakota people would call it, and also Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara people. So let's pray. And this is the prayer, by the way. We've got a number of prayer cards that you're welcome to on Black Elk. As many of you know, that there's a canonization afoot for him by the Catholic Church. He's now a servant of God, and the case is under investigation by the church, and you're welcome to the prayer cards as well on your way out. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, Great Spirit, behold us who stand before you singing our song of thanksgiving for Black Elk. Faithfully, Black Elk walked the sacred red road and generously witnessed the good news of our Lord Jesus Christ among the Native American people. We humbly ask you to hear the prayers we plead through his intercession. We ask Holy Mother Church to recognize his sanctity by acknowledging his presence among the company of saints, and as one to imitate in his zeal for the gospel. Open our hearts also to recognize the risen Christ in other cultures and peoples, to your glory and honor, through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, our speaker, Dr. Damian Costello. He received his PhD in theological studies from the University of Dayton and specializes in the intersection of Catholic theology, indigenous spiritual traditions, and colonial history. Dr. Costello is an international expert on the life and legacy of Nicholas Black Elk and the author of Black Elk, Colonialism and Lakota Catholicism. Dr. Costello's work is informed by 5 years of ethnographic work on the Navajo Nation, and he serves as Director of Postgraduate Studies for an Indigenous learning community, an Indigenous-run ATS-accredited theological graduate school, and is a founding member and an American co-director of the Indigenous Catholic Research Fellowship. Dr. Costello is an award-winning contributor to the United States Catholic Magazine and American Magazine and National Catholic Reporter. And yesterday he wanted me to highlight, and I'll do it again today, one of his articles as we're probably anxiously awaiting the Christmas season and Advent seasons. His article, How a Charlie Brown Christmas Became America's Passion Play, in U.S. Catholic Magazine. So without further ado, we're grateful to have on our campus here at the University of Mary, Dr. Damian Costello, all the way from the great state of Vermont.
Thank you. Am I on here? Yes, now I am. No? We have the green light. Test. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. As he mentioned, I'm a Catholic theologian, and there's so many different ways you can look at Nicholas Black Elk. On Saturday at the Heritage Center, we're going to focus more on Black Elk from an Indigenous perspective and how he's relevant for Indigenous people today. Not just Indigenous people, but all people in the Dakotas in North America. But I'm going to look at Black Elk from the perspective of a Catholic theologian. And I came from a space very much like you when I discovered Black Elk. I went to a small Catholic college, Mount St. Mary's University in Maryland, about 1,200 students. And I was not as good a student as probably most of you are, or at least you seem to me. I love to learn, but I hadn't really discovered where my intellectual home was. And so when I should have been doing my homework and focusing on my papers, I was in the library just to the right of that picture right there, picking off books off the shelf. And one of them that I discovered my sophomore year was Black Elk Speaks. And I read it and was captivated. You know, like many of the East Coast people that you'd come across, particularly in the summer, you know, we all flock out here, we go to the Black Hills, we talk about how beautiful it is, and we go look, you know, for the history. And I was one of those people. I'd come out here as a kid, went to the Black Hills. And so I loved this book. It's the story of a holy man. He had a great vision I'll tell you about. And he was at the Battle of Little Bighorn, Wounded Knee, and he spent his life trying to discern what his spiritual calling meant. And so that captivated me. And I happened to bring the book into my theology class the next semester. This is the beginning of my junior year. And the professor saw it. And he said, "Oh, Damian, that's a great book." And of course I said, "Yeah, it's phenomenal." He said, "Did you know he was Catholic?" And that was, you could have said so many different things about Black Elk. That was the last thing that I would have expected from what I read. The story only goes up till he's about 25 years old, and you're left with the impression that he never really did anything else, that he was this defeated old man. And so he said to me, "You know, you've been looking for something to do. Why don't you do a project on Black Elk? Why don't you think about, read about how this could be possible?" Now, I think I had a sense that Native people could be Christian or Catholic, but I definitely didn't think that if you came from such a rich tradition and you were a holy person, a medicine man, you wouldn't have any interest in Catholicism or the church. That was my expectation. So I spent the whole semester reading everything I could find about Black Elk. I followed him to graduate school. I followed my wife to the Navajo reservation for 5 years, and this became really my life study unexpectedly. Well, Black Elk grew up back in the old buffalo hunting days, and when he was 9 years old, he was with his people following the buffalo, and he got sick. And he stopped to get a drink of water with his friends, and he collapsed. His friends brought him to his parents. They set up the teepee, they stopped the camp, and he went unconscious and remained so for 12 days. Up to this point, he had been hearing voices for about a year or two. And they had been saying, now is the time. A sacred voice is calling you. And he had no idea what that meant. It scared him. He had no guidance in these matters, and he didn't tell anybody. Well, what happened when he was unconscious, what he remembered, is two men with wings coming down from the sky and this little cloud appearing next to him. And so he walked out, got in the cloud, and went up into the sky world, into the heavens. And the horse nations of the four directions danced for him and brought him to the cloud teepee of the six grandfathers, who, like in our Christian tradition, we have three gods in one person. In Lakota way, the six directions represent all the powers of the universe. The Creator called him and gave him these sacred gifts. Gave him a bow, which he's holding there, a cup of water, sacred pipe, and a flowering stick. And they sent him on a great journey down the Black Road, where he conquered drought, this big battle, pages and pages of description, and then sent him down the good Red Road, where at the end there was a sacred hoop that you see here, and in the middle the flowering tree, and all his people were around it. And they were all renewed. All the suffering that his people had been undergoing. This is the beginning of the U.S. Army and people coming in and really changing Lakota context. And then they took him up to what is now Black Elk Peak in the Black Hills, and he looked around and he saw the hoops of all the nations, and he joked when he gave the interview to John Neihart, the interviewer, and said, I don't know if I saw white people there. But then after a pregnant pause, I said, no, you were there too. This is everybody. And so the six grandfathers brought him back to the teepee and sent him home. He said, now you've been sent. You will lead your people through difficult times. You will renew them. You will plant the sacred tree. And here he is, 9 years old, this very poignant moment where after all this action, all this intimacy with the spirit world, he's walking alone across the prairie, not knowing what this meant. Well, it took him a long time. He put it off for about 6 or 7 years before he told his vision to a medicine person. And this person was blown away, said, we've never heard a vision like this. They got the whole village together and reenacted it in ceremony. In Lakota way, if you receive a vision, you have to reenact it so that the spirits recognize that you've accepted it and that the gifts of power you've received can be activated. And so they reenacted this whole vision. And he spent the rest of his life trying to discern what this meant for him. Things were radically changing for the Lakota. I can't get into too much detail, but this is the time. Right as he accepts his vision, he's going back to be settled on the reservation for the first time. And we'll talk a bit about that. But as he goes through life, there's these three ways that overlap that he thinks he's living out his vision. The first is as a traditional healer. The second is in the Christian way. And the last is as a revitalizer of Lakota tradition. So the first way, so much of this I could talk for hours just on this, because I think as non-native people, we don't really have any context for what traditional healing is. We're so used to the very prominent and damaging stereotype, this is paganism or demon worship. Well, what we should know about this tradition, what the most important part is singing over the patient, often all night long. There's all this research coming out. I'm sure you've seen the mindfulness meditation of how that works on the brain and how it heals you. Singing has a very similar effect. So he spent the early part of his life after accepting his vision as a traditional healer up until 1904 when he accepted baptism. He may have continued in some form. I think he did in a very Catholic form. Some Lakota people will say that he continued to practice this underground, but we don't know for sure. The second way, the Christian way, is what we'll spend the most time on, because I'm a Catholic theologian, we're in a Catholic context, and we're thinking about what this means. In 1904, he was baptized and spent the rest of his life as a prominent Catholic leader, a lay leader. He was married, he had kids. And his Catholic faith, I think, is so relevant to people of your age and my experience when I encountered Black Elk, because I think that he discovered the core of Christianity studying abroad, so to speak. When a couple years after he settled on the reservation, after he became a medicine man, he joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. It was this traveling circus with like 200 performers, half of them native, where they would recreate the buffalo hunt, the Battle of Little Bighorn, except in this version, Custer won. They would do dances, and they would sell out arenas in the East Coast, New York City, and then they went on to England and France. Black Elk signed up because it was a good job, in part, like many of his friends. You made a good income in a time when there was really no work. And the irony was, you could be a celebrity by being who you were, where back at home, this is when you're starting to be reprogrammed into something you're not. So imagine that, going abroad to be who you are. An unfree choice, but it was a beautiful opportunity that many of the performers really valued. Anyway, so they end up in England, which at the time was the largest city on the planet, 4 million people, and the center of the largest empire the world has ever seen. England can control 25% of the globe. Now, this looks more like the England I expect. I have that Downton Abbey impression of what England was. Like, everybody's in these nice estates, and you're having these tea ceremonies, and people that take care of you, and these big lawns. But the reality is that London was much more like a city like Port-au-Prince or Calcutta than what we think of. There was no sewers. Animals still moved everything. So you walked through the manure and the mud every single day. This was the Industrial Revolution. There's letters that the performers would write back, say, this is a strange place. You don't see the sun for weeks at a time. It's very difficult. But in the process, they're getting to know the European world from the inside. They're forming real relationships, and many of them fell in love. A couple of them brought their wives back who settled on the reservation. Black Elk fell in love. And they're also investigating our spiritual ways. They would go to churches and have conversations. One pastor in Scotland, his wife remembered that these performers have an insatiable desire for hymns. They would learn these hymns, and they'd want copies of them so they could bring them home. And they absolutely astonished, I think it was Westminster Abbey, when 40 of the performers, native performers, went there and sang the most popular American hymn at the time, Nearer My God to Thee, in the Lakota language. So they had already been absorbing this back at home. And Black Elk was probably one of those performers. And this is a snippet from one of the letters he wrote. He wrote 3 or 4 letters in Lakota back to his people, where he says, one custom here is pretty good, the way they talk about Creator. They talk about God. That's what I'm looking at. And if any of you have studied abroad or traveled, you know that it's not in the midst of your journey that you really understand what's important about it, right? If you've studied abroad or you've done an immersion trip, it's often when you come home, you come back to your own context, your own ways, and you sort of realize, okay, this is what's important about my journey. And so 6 months after Black Elk got home, after 3 years abroad, he wrote this letter, and this is part of it. He starts out by saying, this was a really difficult way of life, and I didn't find anything good. I had gone, and Black Elk Speaks, he says, I went because I was a holy person, and I wanted to see, was there anything good I can bring back? And he says, the one thing I found, the only custom was his faith and how they lived according to it. That's what I wanted to understand. And he goes on to quote 1 Corinthians 13, that beautiful hymn about love, that if you get married or you've been to weddings, chances are, if you're Catholic, you're hearing this reading. That's the essence of what he found. And so it took some time. We can't go through all the details, but eventually that translated into his baptism in the Catholic Church. And he does have some impressive stats. So he served as a catechist, which is like for us today, it would be like a permanent deacon. He ran the church when the Jesuit wasn't around, which was 29 out of the 30 days. He would preach in Lakota. He'd baptize babies. He brought over 400 people into the church. Godfather to 130. I have like 7 godchildren, and I can't even remember them all. And he was a long-term missionary. He went to Yankton in the eastern part of the state where they have a different dialect, and his whole family went with him, and his daughter said, "We were there for so long that when I came back, the kids in Pine Ridge made fun of me because I talked like the kids in Yankton." He also went to Wind River in Wyoming, where he introduced this beautiful custom of traditional dancing at Christmas time in the full regalia. Now, there's 3 sources that I think are important to his Catholic life that I think sort of prefigure where we are today. And the first one is this sort of evangelical way of being Catholic. You know, if you're familiar with Franciscan University, Scott Hahn and all his disciples, right? Lay people who are theologians like me, who really own their faith and are translating it in sort of an evangelical style. And that's what Black Elk did. He got the Dakota version of the Bible that Protestants translated. The Catholics didn't translate the whole thing. Taught himself to read and became famous for his knowledge of Scripture, the way he could quote it and tell the stories in that old Lakota way, just like the elders used to do in the councils that were held. And there he is preaching outside of a teepee there to the young. He had a very sort of devotional Catholicism that I don't think many of us would expect with a Native American holy man. He had a big devotion to the Sacred Heart and the Rosary, which, well, I have 2 diversions here that I'm going to dig a little bit deeper to give you a little snapshot into how much there is that we just can't cover. And one of them is the Rosary. The Rosary, to me, I grew up saying the Rosary. My mother was into Medjugorje, you know, and I didn't have a problem with it. It just seemed kind of boring to me. Well, it was not boring to the Lakota. Beads are incredibly important for Native culture. When Lewis and Clark came through here and went to the West Coast and back, they said, we could have gone the whole way and back with just a bag of blue beads because they were so highly valued. And when Father de Smet came through, he would pass out rosaries. And people wanted them. And you see here, Sitting Bull. Can't tell the whole story, but this is during the Great Sioux Wars. De Smet goes into his camp unarmed with just some guides and counsels with him for 4 days and gives him his rosary. And so what you see wearing there is probably de Smet's rosary. It might be a different one. Some people say Sitting Bull gave it away, but then got another one that was just like it. And there's an interesting commonality between the origin of the rosary, the story we tell, and Lakota spiritual ways. And so St. Dominic, you may have heard this story, is credited with being given the rosary by the Virgin Mary. He was known as an amazing preacher. He's from Spain. He went to France to convert the Albigensians, and for a whole year he had no effect. And so he said, okay, I've got to stop. I've got to recenter myself. And so what he did is he went out into the wilderness and fasted and prayed for 3 days. And after humbling himself, Virgin Mary appeared to him, gave him the rosary, and said, with this gift, with this power, you will convert the Albigensians. Now, if you're a good Lakota person, know the Lakota ways, you are instantly picking up the Vision Quest. Have you all heard of the Vision Quest before? A really, really important spiritual practice across North America, but one of the primary places of its highest importance is among the Lakota people. And what you do, you go out to a hilltop or the wilderness, you fast and pray for 3 or 4 days, and the spirits visit you and give you a gift. So there was a time in the Catholic Church not too long ago, we used to say that people of other religions, you're sort of an anonymous Catholic, anonymous Christian. You're good, you don't know Jesus, but you kind of follow him. And you can imagine a Lakota elder sort of chuckling and saying, oh, St. Dominic, he's sort of an anonymous Lakota. He knows our ways. Well, Black Elk loved the rosary. And in the Lakota context, it was sort of a new healing ceremony. If you were sick in the old times, you'd call the medicine person over and they would sing their songs over you and do ceremony. In the Catholic context, that was not okay, according to the missionaries. And so what would happen is you would call the catechist over and they would say the rosary with your family. And so that was one of the biggest parts of his ministry. I love this little detail. He was known for, as he was an elder, walking to church and saying the rosary with a friend of his, another elder. And in the interviews for the Knights of Columbus documentary on Native American Catholicism, there was an elder who remembered that Black Elk used to count the distance that he walked by the number of rosaries he said. So, how far is it to get over to Chesterton House? He'd say, it's probably about a rosary and a half. That's how deeply Black Elk inhabited this prayer. And then the final thing, which we'll talk about his Lakota spirituality, when he talked about that, about the earth. He talked about how understanding the earth and relating to it, every one of your steps should be as a prayer. And so I love that image of Black Elk, the elder, saying the rosary that St. Dominic had gotten in a vision quest, that Sitting Bull proudly wore around his neck, counting the distance by the rosary, and then each step being a prayer in the Lakota way, bringing that together. Okay, so we're sort of getting to the two-thirds of the way done, maybe. The third source of his Catholicism and the third way he lived out his vision. Remember, he's always discerning. He's trying to figure out. He spends a lot of his time like we do. Like, I don't know if I'm really following what I'm called to do. He spent a lot of time wrestling with that. The third way was living his Lakota spirituality and reviving the Lakota way. We can't spend a lot of time on this, but I'm sure this is familiar to you, the boarding schools. Right? This is actually not Catholic school. This is a Navajo gentleman who went to Carlisle Indian School. The first one was actually on a military base. If you go to Carlisle today, it's a U.S. Army base. This was a U.S. Department of War policy. This is the transformation in 3 years. Church participated in that, and man, we should have a lot more conversation about that. Hopefully we can at some point. But Black Elk recognized the damage that this was doing to the kids in the community. This is when alcoholism, mental health issues really start to grow in Native communities. And so he and the elders decide, we've got to do something. We have to be proactive to save these ways. So in 1931, he passes on his vision to John Neihart, and it becomes Black Elk Speaks, that book that I discovered, and hopefully you will at some point in your education. This is my other little diversion, which I think is just so important for this context. Before he did that, he started the Duhamel Sioux Indian pageant in the Black Hills, starting in 1927. And the source of this, or his partner, I should say, was a Knight of Columbus. This is Alex Duhamel, and the Knights were founded in Rapid City in 1910. He was a prominent businessman who also spoke Lakota. His family had a history down in Pine Ridge, where Black Elk was from. I don't know the original connection. It's probably related to the church. But Black Elk had wanted to start performing again, go back to that life of being a showman. He wanted to demonstrate his Lakota spirituality and culture to the people that were coming, the people like me, who were coming to the Black Hills and wanted to learn about it. And so Duhamel had land up in the Black Hills. He said, all right, you and your family, just like in the old days when you used to come into the Black Hills in the hot summertime, you come up here and you do what you want. Now, what I find interesting is that at this time, the church was still very much uncertain about Native people and part of the forces that were repressing their culture. And here, a Knight of Columbus, who I think some people stereotype as maybe very backward thinking or conservative or whatever criticism you want to make, was in the forefront of allowing Black Elk to publicly re-inhabit his Lakota spirituality and saying, this is good for us. And this, I think, became the basis of his last book that was published shortly before he died. The interviews were 1947 and 8. He died in 1950. And this is just a Black Elk's account of the 7 sacred ceremonies of Lakota tradition. And I love how he starts it. He starts by saying, I've been told about Jesus. I think it's true. He came to bring peace on earth. That's a good thing. However, we all should know, native and non-native, the greatness and truth of Lakota ways, because it doesn't just bring peace among each other, between human beings, but between human beings and the earth. And that's something we're missing. All right, my one question for you. Who knows who this is while I take a drink of water? Thomas Aquinas. When did he live? Anybody know? I got some Catholic theologians here, don't I? 1100s, right? What happened in the 1100s that really influenced Thomas Aquinas? What was his project? Come on, I come from liberal, secular Vermont. You guys are supposed to help me out here.
Are you talking about the translations?
Yeah, okay. Of translations of?
Aristotle.
Aristotle. And what did he write with Aristotle? Which all of you have read probably to some degree. The Summa. Yes. And Aristotle, where did that come from? You know where this came from? It had been lost in Europe for centuries. Yeah? From the Muslims. Through maybe Ireland? I'm not familiar with that. That's possible. But it was from Islamic thinkers. There were a lot of people who were not too happy with what Aquinas did, who basically said, okay, let me get this straight, Tom. You want to take something from the heretics that was written by a pagan and use it to write about Jesus? Not in my church. But Thomas, as the church has always done, took Aristotle, read it in light of Christ, and drew out something very beautiful that brought out new things about the faith we didn't see before. And today, many of us think, what is more traditional than Aquinas? You want the traditional answer, you go to Aquinas, don't you? So it's my contention that Black Elk is very much like Thomas Aquinas in this way. We're starting to recognize that as non-Indigenous people, hey, we didn't treat Indigenous people well, and we didn't understand their culture. How do we understand it better and appropriately for us? And I think that's what Black Elk is doing. If you go back to this book and you read it, you'll see that it's not your standard account of Lakota tradition, that he has edited out things that don't quite jive with Catholic theology, Christian theology, like there's nothing about witchcraft, for example, and the Creator, God, is at the center. Before this dialogue, Lakota people say there was no great spirit in like one unitary creator sense. So this, I think, is sort of like a summa for Native tradition when read in light of Black Elk's Catholic life. Anyway, and these are just some of the themes where we'd be inclined to say, if we don't know much about Native culture, we'd say, oh, are you worshiping the buffalo? Is that your God? You say, no, that's not our God. That's our sibling. We have a relationship with the buffalo. Maybe you should start having relationships with your cows. And this is how we honor it. The buffalo gives its life, and so we give of ourselves to the buffalo so that they will respond. And it's centered upon an important value where a lot of our religious life and national civic life is centered on liberty, which isn't wrong. Indigenous values in Lakota ways really wants to emphasize the value of harmony. Well, wrapping up here. I think 2 slides left. Black Elk's death, 1950, is remembered as a miracle. There was an incredible display of the Northern Lights the night of his wake that people in Pine Ridge, both Lakota and Jesuit, remember as being a miracle about Black Elk. This is a Jesuit account. There's pictures of it. A Toronto observatory took a picture because this is across North America. And 2 really important things happened in 2016. Last slide. In 2016, the highest point in the Black Hills, which was Harney Peak, where Black Elk went in his vision, was changed. The name was changed to Black Elk Peak. Now, how cool is that? I know there was some difficult feelings in South Dakota about this, but from a Catholic perspective, we could have a mountain named after a saint. Wow. And the second thing is that's George Looks Twice. Oh, I should have pointed this out. Let's see if we can get it back. The little boy there in the picture is George Looks Twice. And at the canonization mass of St. Kateri, he met an archivist from Marquette, and together they put together a petition that became the beginning of the cause for canonization for Black Elk, which has jumped through a couple stages and is now at the Vatican, and we're hopeful he'll be declared venerable soon, but we're waiting to hear that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Costello. We'll take some questions, and in the process of questions, we'll do a drawing. So if your name's drawn and you'd like to grab a book, you're welcome to. We also have some prayer cards on your way out, and then Dr. Costello will be out in the foyer signing some books for purchase as well. Okay, any questions? Anybody has? Yes, question over here.
So I'm a youth minister up in Turtle Mountain, and one of the biggest struggles for my kids is involving their culture in their faith. So this is actually really cool, very inspiring to go to. But what is, like, for you, like, what would you give as advice, as like a starting point to one of those teens who's trying to navigate being, trying to appreciate their culture, their spirituality, but also understanding the Catholic faith as the way?
Wow, great question, and I just happen to have the photo of where I think we need to start. St. John Paul II. So this was the 80s, and I can remember sitting with some Catholic Indigenous elders in Canada. We were at the papal vicar, and I'm not going to get the representative of the Pope in Canada, in Ottawa. And this was a couple years ago when they were asking the Pope to come. And they talked about when this occurred. They were talking about, this happened in Canada as well, that the Pope allowed himself to be smudged, which is, it's basically like incense in church, except you put it over yourself as a purification, which in enculturated liturgies, in the native context, you'll do that at the penitential rite. And they said when they saw this happen, all the decades and centuries of being told, either explicitly or implicitly, that, hey, you can't be an Indian and be in this church, went away. And people were crying. So, to your answer, to think about where do we start? Like, we have to put ourselves in this space where don't be afraid. You know, Standing Rock is just right this direction. This way. I know where it is. I just don't know where the window is. How many of you have been to Standing Rock? That's good, a lot of you. So much of indigenous life is being forced to come into our world. You really can't do anything of any value in larger society without coming and doing things our way. And one way to start is to say, okay, I'm going to start turning that around even a little bit. I'm going to put myself in an indigenous space. So inhabit that spirit, learn as much as you can, be respectful, and don't think that as a non-indigenous person, you're really ever in a space to teach Native people about their culture, right? There's people who can do that much better than any of us can do. Like, okay, some of us, like me, can talk about it because it's important, but allow the teaching to happen from other places. But be open, have a spirit of openness, I would say.
We're going to draw a name, so if you don't mind drawing a name for me, thank you. First book winner is Jacob Morgan. Congratulations. Come down and grab a book. Other questions? We'll go over to this side of the room. Any questions? Questions? Yes. And you get to draw a name too.
Yeah, so you mentioned kind of some of the Lakotan way of viewing and dedication that Black Elk had to like the Sacred Heart and the Rosary. Could you kind of speak specifically to the relationship with the Eucharist and kind of how the Lakotas viewed that?
Mm-hmm. They're very strong devotion to the Eucharist. I was going to include this actually, but one great example is they would have Corpus Christi parades. And one of the first things I talked about, Black Elk starting to revive the Lakota way in 1910. And one of the earliest examples we have of that is that during this Eucharistic procession of hundreds of people, literally, Black Elk led it in his regalia. And so, adoration was a very big part of the Lakota way. All of the stereotypes we have a traditional pre-Vatican II liturgy is true or even more so in Lakota context in the past. For example, Black Elk is remembered of singing his grandchildren to sleep. This is towards the end of his life, when he's doing all this Lakota stuff, with Latin hymns from the Mass. And, I could go on forever, but the Lakota word for Jesus is Wanikia, and that translates as he who makes live. So in Lakota way of looking at spirits, everything is understood as what is your defining essence, your power. So sage, if you've ever smelled it, is very pungent, right? A little even sharp. And so that's why it's understood as having this purifying spiritual power, not just symbolizing it, but enacting it. And so when they looked at Christ, they said, what's Christ's defining essence? And we say this, life. He came so that we may have life in its fullest. And so they understood that about Christ, and in the Eucharist, they understood as the essence of life in a tangible way. So there's one, Patrick Mason, he's a Knight of Columbus, he's Osage, and he's on their executive council. If you ever watched the movie Enduring Faith, he's in that. And he says, you go to a suburban parish, a lot of the kids might have a tough time with the real presence. In a Native context, that's not a radical claim. Spirits are everywhere. And so to say that it's in that wafer, that's just natural. Does everyone believe it? No, not everybody's Christian. We all varied. But the Eucharist is real in a way that sometimes I think we may have a hard time fully inhabiting.
Okay, another drawing for a book. It says Doug. I have a feeling I know which Doug that is. Just
Is this rigged?
No, this would be my youngest son, Douglas Taylor. Congratulations. And it's very fitting because it's his birthday today, so happy birthday, bud.
To you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Doug. Happy birthday to you.
Very good. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Question. No one's raising their hand because they're like, yeah, I got to draw that for that book thing. Questions? Okay, over here. Anybody here? No? Okay.
Could you please go back to the slide about the quote of the earth being our mother and every step needs to be taken as prayer?
Yes. And that's found in the Sacred Pipe, that book. Yeah, go ahead. Did you have a question or you just wanted to see the quote again? Okay, yeah.
It seems to me that this final quote here about every step being taken as a prayer seems to align somewhat with Pope Francis's emphasis on the way in which we as Catholics are responsible for the earth and the way that we should be stewards of it. So I'm just wondering if you have found in studying Black Elk that he has any insights into how we could better answer that call that the Pope is currently giving us.
Great question, great connection. You know, one thing I would say that Black Elk helps us to elevate, you know, Pope Francis is saying, okay, there's really three models of relating to the earth. One is dominion, right? It's ours, we can do what we want with it. Nobody can tell me otherwise. Then there's stewardship, which is very good, right? We've been entrusted with it. We got to take care of it because it's ours. But what Pope Francis is challenging us to inhabit that Franciscan perspective, which is really an indigenous perspective, where, you know, that kind of comes off, I think, maybe superficially at times, like brother, sun, sister, moon, right? Well, what Francis is saying, and I think what really he believed and enacted, is that is my sibling created by God, that I have a relationship to. And so when I interact with the earth, I'm not just taking care of it because it's mine. I am maintaining right relationship with it, like I would hopefully maintain right relationship with you. And so Black Elk, I think, gives us maybe a deeper sort of meditation of what that can look like. You know, I would say as we're wrapping up here, you know, most of us come from people who came to this land relatively recently, right? It's only natural that we develop these relationships. Our people, whoever you are, were indigenous at some point and had these relationships. Is anybody here of Irish descent at all? Most of us have, a lot of us have some, right? If you go to Ireland, the Irish Catholicism and then the Irish tradition that came before that is very similar to Lakota spirituality, that relational connection to everything around you. And you think of St. Patrick's great prayer, like invoking the power of the rocks, the ocean, the lightning, the fire. So I think Black Elk helps us to think about how do we recover that in our spirituality, in our way of life, for where we are right now, and sort of grow roots into the land that we stand on.
All right, very good. We're going to do one more drawing, and then we'll wrap up. And again, I want to invite you to prayer cards that are down in front if you'd like. Also, Dr. Costello will be out in the foyer, and we'll have some books for sale as well. The dialogue will continue, so feel free to participate in some of our other events. And here's our final book winner.
Trinity Reether.
Trinity, congratulations, and thank you, Dr. Costello. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good rest of your day and have a great weekend.